Hi, this is the beginning of Chapter 5 lecture notes. This is Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5 is going to look at the American Revolution, so that includes the buildup of tensions to the American Revolution, the revolution itself, and then kind of the immediate aftermath and how the war ends and how they come to a peace and an understanding with a tentative peace and understanding with the British following the end of the war. This first slide that we're going to start off on here in just a second is a video clip. It is a video game trailer. One of the really cool things about U.S. history is it comes up a lot in popular culture today, whether it's in TV shows, movies, books, or even a video game. And so I like using this particular trailer because it shows different perspectives or different types of people during the revolution as they are portrayed in a video game. And this trailer, it's for an older game now, but they recently did a remastered version of it for the PlayStation in the last year or so. And this is for Assassin's Creed 3. So I'm going to play the trailer for you. If you don't want to watch the trailer, it's about 1 minute and 30-ish seconds long. So if you want to skip to about the 3-minute mark in the YouTube video, you can go ahead and do that, and then we're going to continue with notes once the video is over.
Peggy 18.
When I sacrifice my youth to defend what's ours.
When I say no to a law we never voted for.
When I stop feeding an empire a world away. When I surrender my body, not my mind. When I ask God to look the other way.
When I refuse to learn the history of a country I'll never see.
When I decide, it will be them, not us.
Okay, so that particular trailer is really cool in that you have different perspectives, all the way from a soldier to somebody who was working in the fields, to a clergyman, to a wife or a mom with her daughters at home because her husband and sons have gone off to war. There's a lot of different and multiple perspectives from that particular trailer. So it's something to think about that, the history we talk about in here, not only this semester, but next semester, it's relevant. It comes up in pop culture all the time. And you're going to start seeing stuff that, comes up in the news or in television shows that you watch, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, we talked about that, or I read about that for class. That is crazy. I've never noticed that before. And so that's one of the cool things about U.S. history is it's literally everywhere. And so I hope that as we continue through our studies this year, you start to see more and more of that and then feel like, oh my goodness, I know what's going on now. But we're going to go ahead and start our focus on Chapter 5. Again, Chapter 5 focuses on a 20-year time period from 1763 until 1783. But just to quickly recap Chapter 4, or the end of Chapter 4, we looked at the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is a part of a larger global war known as the 7 Years' War. And it's just the result of the 7 Years' War spilling over into the North American continent and the British colonies. In the 7 Years' War, you had two sides of the conflict. You had Austria, Prussia, and Britain they were a part of an alliance, and they are going to be fighting the French and the Spanish in Europe, right? For trade dominance, for naval dominance, and then for land or political dominance, right? So this is a conflict happening in Europe, and it spills over into this colonial region in North America. And the colonial aspect of the 7 Years' War is called the French and Indian War. So if you see it both, one or two ways, just know they're the same conflict. It just depends on your point of view or your perspective that you're looking at it. But the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, will take place between 1754 and 1763. And just to kind of recap for you, in 1754, a very young and very green George Washington is going to go rat out the French soldiers in the Ohio River Valley and was very unsuccessful. Ultimately, he'll see the majority of his men under his command killed in the conflict that starts. But the conflict that happens at that moment is what starts the conflict of the French and Indian War in 1754. So as we discussed in chapter 4, the British are not going to be on the winning side of that war for the majority of that war. It won't be until the Prime Minister, William Pitt, comes into office and he begins to take out massive amounts of debt in order to help finance the war, not only for the colonies' sake, but also for Britain and Europe. Britain is going to be struggling pretty heavily in the 7 Years' War. However, once this war is over, England is going to shift from being in the margins of power in Europe to becoming a leader of power in Europe. So the 16 and 1700s have really transformed Britain as a political force and economic force in Europe, largely due to their success in colonization and implementing the mercantilist economic system in cooperation with their colonies. But the 1700s is a very expensive time for Europe, and it's an expensive time for Britain. You have 4 different wars that take place in the 1700s. You have Queen Anne's War from 1702 until 1713. You have the War of Jenkins' Ear from 1739 to 1742, dealing with Spain. And then you have King George's War from 1740 until 1748. And then the 7 Years' War. So this is a very expensive time for Europe, and it's an expensive time for the British. And so once the French and Indian War is over, and we have now moved into this, post-war period, the time of what's known as salutary neglect is over for the colonies. Salutary neglect means the period before the French and Indian War where Britain, they're keeping an eye on what's happening in the colonies. Obviously, they're profiting from the shipping routes that have been set up in the Atlantic and this mercantile system that's been put into place. But for the most part, colonial society and colonial governments are left to their own devices during the 1700s. And this neglect, this salutary neglect on the part of the British government and British Parliament will quickly come to an end after the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 because they have a massive debt they have to pay back. After the war, the amount of debt that is on the shoulders of the British Treasury, Britain will owe roughly, in the 1760s, they'll owe roughly 150 million pounds sterling, which in today's money is tens of trillions of dollars. And so half of what they actually owed was interest on the loans. So the loans that William Pitt had taken out were high in interest rate, meaning the money they're charging you just to take out the principal or main interest of the loan. And so the British Parliament and the government, they had to take quick action in order to basically pay off their debt. And once the decision is made to raise taxes, now I do want to note, taxes are raised in England as well. Some taxes will be higher in England than they are in the colonies, and vice versa. The issue, or the root issue that starts all of this tension, is the colonies, they don't particularly enjoy paying the taxes that they have to pay, but where they are upset or where they get a sticker in their fly is they do not like having these taxes determined and then settled upon them without any representation in Parliament. Okay, so they're unhappy with not, with having to pay extra taxes, especially merchants and the colonial elites who have been banking off of mercantile policies up until this time. But really, it's the lack of representation that kind of widespread in the colonies has people upset. And so in order to pay off this debt, Prime Minister George Grenville, okay, so now that the war is over, we have a new Prime Minister. He is going to start raising taxes. And this was a way to hopefully pay off debts quickly, but it was also in the hope that there could be a consolidation of power in the colonies. They're wanting to consolidate. One, they're taking more notice on what's happening in the colonies now that they've spent all this time and money on them to protect them. And they want to crack down, so to say, on the rules and law enforcement. So that period of, you know what, you guys, you're bringing in money, you're doing okay, we're going to let you do what you need to do. That time, that kind of laid back attitude or the salutary neglect period, it is over after 1763. And it's a quick and abrupt end to that kind of freedom that the colonists had enjoyed. And now that that is over, right, and they have more notice being put upon them, colonists, they're gonna rifle at that a little bit. They're gonna bristle at that. So there are going to be a series of taxes that are passed during this early period to help kind of offset the cost of the cost of these wars. And there's going to be kind of these early stirrings of discontent in the colonies, but ultimately people are not just, right out the gate willing to cut ties and have a revolution. It is going to be a growing discontent over the 1760s and early 1770s that leads to this call for revolution. And even the call for revolution will not be widespread through the colonies. You will still have people who are very loyal to the empire and the crown. And so something I just want to point out before we talk about these taxes is this concept of revolution. And popular icons or political cartoons or art that sometimes get misconstrued or they get associated, I would say more so than misconstrued, they get associated with the revolution when they're really around long before the actual revolution even begins. And the primary example I have for you is this political cartoon that was drawn by Benjamin Franklin, and it was published in the newspapers across the colonies in May of 1754. And this was basically a call to the colonies during this early portion, right? 1754. This is like 20 years before the revolution even begins, okay? For the colonies to unite, right? That they were only going to survive this conflict with the French and their Native American allies and then this broader global war. The only way we were going to survive was to unite and to help the motherland, right? So this join or die picture, it gets associated with the revolution and it will be revived during the revolutionary years, but it originates 20 years before the revolution even begins. So the idea of unifying and having kind of a solid and common purpose, it's not a new idea by the time the revolution starts. It was already something that had kind of been explored before the early stages or during the early stages of the French and Indian War. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here, and when in part two, we're going to start talking about taxation and kind of the growing resistance that begins to emerge with the implementing of these taxes on the colonies.